la bestialidad imperialista. Bestialidad que no tiene una frontera determinada ni pertenece a un país determinado. Bestias fueron las hordas hitleristas, como bestias son los norteamericanos hoy, como bestias son los paracaidistas belgas, como bestias fueron los imperialistas franceses en Argelia. Porque es la naturaleza del imperialismo la que bestializa a los hombres, la que la convierte en fieras sedientas de sangre que están dispuestas a degollar, a asesinar, a destruir hasta la última imagen de un revolucionario, de un partidario de un régimen que haya caído bajo su bota o que luche por su libertad. Y la estatua que recuerda a Lumumba, hoy destruida pero mañana reconstruida, nos recuerda también en la historia trágica de ese mártir de la revolución del mundo, que no se puede confiar en el imperialismo, pero ni tantito así, nada.
Yo, what's up, everybody? Welcome to episode 23, Unmasking Imperialism, exposing imperialist propaganda in mainstream media. Today, kind of an urgent situation, emergency stream, protests in Cuba, made in USA. The imperialists are once again trying a color revolution on our sisters and brothers of Cuba, Cuba Socialista, Cuba Soberana. And the people of Cuba are rising up against this color revolution in solidarity with the Communist Party of Cuba, in solidarity with their revolution. Today, we're talking about the US-backed protests in Cuba that are happening, that took place yesterday as well as today, and how corporate news outlets are falsely portraying them as nationwide uprisings. US funding and support for this fake grassroots movement, the root causes of the economic hardship in Cuba, sanctions, imperialist US blockade, and the media war, the propaganda war. I'm sure we've all seen, everybody who's on this stream watching and listening. Shout out to all of you, by the way, who are watching and listening. I'm sure we've all seen these idiots on social media posting SOS Cuba. They haven't posted anything about any other uprisings, but somehow now they care about Cuba. Now they care about human rights. And so we're going to be talking about all this. Joining me are my two good comrades, my homies, Onyesonwu and Yhamir. Onyesonwu is a cadre with the All-African People's Revolutionary Party and the All-African Women's Revolutionary Union, an editor with Hood Communist. Shout out to AAPRP and Hood Communist, and a member of the National Coordinating Committee for the Venceremos Brigade. Shout out to Venceremos. Please subscribe to her channel with the AAPRP New Mexico branch. The link is in the description. How's it going, Comrade Oni?
Very glad to be here to defend Cuba and chop it up with y'all. I'm excited.
Most definitely. And also joining me, my homie, my brother, Yhamir, Colombian activist based in New York City. Shout out to New York. Born and raised in New York. Shout out to Queens. He is the host of the Bolivarian Flame. Please subscribe to his channel. The link is also in the description. How's it going, brother, Yhamir?
Nah, it's going good, brother. Glad to be back on Unmasking Imperialism with you and Comrade Oni, and to defend Cuba.
Most definitely. And it's crazy because we were talking about this very same thing literally just a few weeks ago. If you haven't checked it out, we did a previous episode called Imperialists Weaponize Hip Hop Against Cuba, talking about the media war, how the imperialists, the CIA uses media, social media, culture, art, and they weaponize it against the Cuban Revolution to make it seem like the Cuban revolutionary government is repressive and reactionary, and the protests are pro-democracy heroes fighting for liberation and freedom. And it's the complete opposite. Check out that episode. These two comrades were on it, and we went over some of the tactics. And lo and behold, a few weeks later, we see this nonsense come out. Yesterday, actually, we were doing a stream yesterday about the DPRK, and I see the news coming out about Cuba. And so I wanted to talk with these two comrades who have been to Cuba and have seen what it's like firsthand and are very involved in the Cuba Solidarity movement. Shout out to everybody who's watching and listening, by the way, to Carena, Orlando, to Comrade B Level, to everybody who's on. I want to start off with a clip from Al Jazeera. And again, Al Jazeera is trash. I hate playing their stuff, but so many people act as if like AJ Plus and Al Jazeera is like progressive. But this is the dominant story that we're hearing in mainstream media about the protests in Cuba.
"We're not afraid," chanted thousands of people on the streets of Havana. Protests like this one happened across the country, expressing frustration over pandemic restrictions and the worsening economic crisis on the island nation.
We are here for the repression because they are killing us with hunger, the houses are falling and we have no homes. They have the money to build hotels while letting us go hungry.
The past year and a half has been difficult for Cuba's economy, as the pandemic has had a devastating impact on the tourism sector. The country was forced to carry out major economic reform. In the past week, the amount of COVID-19 infections rose sharply in the province of Matanzas, where hospitals are struggling to cope. Doctors say they are in desperate need of oxygen and beds to treat patients. President Miguel Díaz-Canel blamed the U.S. embargo for the situation and asked government supporters to take to the streets.
We are not going to admit that any counter-revolutionary mercenary sold out to the government of the United States, sold out to the empire, receiving money from the agencies, allowing themselves to be carried away by all these strategies of ideological subversion to provoke destabilization in our country. There will be a revolutionary response. We call upon all the revolutionaries of the country, all the communists, to take to the streets to any of the places where these provocations are going to take place. Today, from now on, and in the following days.
Security forces arrived soon after the protest started. People were arrested and some clashes broke out between pro and anti-government demonstrators.
State security beat me and my daughter, a minor. They beat us because we were walking down the streets.
Protests like this one are uncommon in Cuba. This is the biggest one to take place since 1994, during what is known as the Special Period, right after the fall of the Soviet Union. For many, they're an example of the changing times on the Caribbean nation, and how many are no longer afraid to speak up. Teresa Bo, Al Jazeera.
So that's the mainstream narrative. I just want to show you guys, before I turn it over to the two comrades on the stream, I want to show you footage of pro-government, pro-revolutionary protesters, because this is something we're never seeing in mainstream media. Thousands of people came out in defense of the Cuban Communist Party, of their revolution. So this is a clip from Causa Chun. Shout out to them. They're doing some great work. This is some pro-government Cubans protesting, defending their revolution. So, very short clip, but it alludes to something bigger, right? All the stories are framing it: opposition protests, nothing about the pro-government, pro-revolution manifestations that are going on across Cuba. But we'll start off with you, Comrade Oni, your reaction to the protests and how mainstream media is covering it.
I mean, that Al Jazeera clip said it all. They talked about unrest in Cuba. They talked about shortages. They talked about, overcrowded hospitals, but they didn't talk about the blockade. They didn't mention the blockade one time. And that's a remarkable oversight. You're clearly trying to push a particular narrative if you're talking about deprivation in a country that's being blockaded and you don't mention the blockade. So that's indicative of how mainstream media has been covering in the West. They're acting like these protests are a result of the government deliberately depriving people, but in reality, they're not getting access to basic supplies. They're not getting access to medicine, to fuel, because of the United States, because of the economic blockade on Cuba. Like, it's intentional to leave that out.
Yeah, most definitely. And what about you, Comrade Yhamir? Your reaction to mainstream media? What have you been seeing online?
I've been seeing a lot of stuff online, like just people making me laugh. Like, I remember this one Cuban girl posted that the soldiers have to go oppress the people. If they don't, then they take away their university or they put them in prison. That made me laugh. But actually, this made me think about what I heard the President Díaz-Canel speak about on Telesur, about like most of the people that were like rallying in these protests, so-called anti-government protests, like there's a good portion that are not against the revolution, that they're not counter-revolutionary, but they are protesting also because of like the severe shortages of food and medicine, the way Oni spoke about it, and that's in connection with the blockade. But now also you have the right-wing Cubans that are counter-revolutionary trying to take advantage of the moment to spew out all this rhetoric of SOS Cuba and the increase of COVID rates, and that the United States needs to intervene with humanitarian aid. And it's just funny because you've had these rates of COVID-19 happen in Brazil, in Colombia, in Haiti, and the United States don't want to intervene there. But with Cuba, for the most part, during this pandemic, they've been okay keeping a stable number. As of right now, yes, rates has gone up, and that's in connection with the shortages and in connection with the blockade. So if the United States generally wants to do something like send humanitarian aid, they would lift that blockade.
No, that's exactly right. And it's like a lot of the right wingers, they act like we're not saying that there's problems. Of course, and even the Cuban Communist Party is the first one to say that there are economic problems, there are shortages of some materials. It's hard. But again, right, the key word here is blockade and sanctions. When you're sanctioned, when you're blockaded, it's almost impossible for you to have the resources necessary to build and uplift your economy. Shout out to B-Level, by the way, who's on the stream watching and listening. He pointed out, we did a podcast a few months ago talking about what's an example of sanctions. And one of the best examples that I have thought about is the way that the imperialist capitalist system in the US treats impoverished single mothers, women who have children, who are trying to feed their children, who make it impossible for them to get a job, who don't get the resources they need. And when they don't have the resources that they need, they get cut off, they get criminalized. They make it seem like they're the problem. They're trying to feed their kid and provide for their family. But because they're not able to work all the time or have access to all the same things that other people do, they're criminalized, they're thrown in jail, they're treated like animals. And it's something similar with sanctioned countries, not just Cuba, but all countries that are sanctioned. And Cuba wants to develop, they're continuing to develop. But when you're sanctioned, blockaded, when you're criminalized for trading with other countries and make it impossible to get the resources, medicine that you need, then it's very hard to treat a lot of those conditions. And so I'm glad you guys pointed that out, because that's really important to point out. I want to play a clip from Miguel Diaz-Canel talking about just what you guys were talking about, comrades, about the economic impact of the blockade, because he gives some information here that is very crucial. This is from Telesur English, so it has some English translation. We'll play a bit of this and then get your reaction.
The energy problem that we already explained, which is a reality, to the lack of supply of food and medicine, and to the problems of the hard currency shocks. We have all those problems. What's the origin of all those problems? What's the main cause? It is the blockade. So it is a hypocrite discourse. It is a discourse of lies, a manipulating discourse. We explained how the blockade affects the energy system. We know how the blockade limits us the obtention of hard currency, and we have to buy food with that hard currency. We need more than 2 billion in hard currency to buy food, but we have to buy supplies for agriculture, we have to buy pots, we have to buy fertilizer, we have to buy more things for the agriculture. And then Vice Minister Alejandro will give economic data. The blockade has limited us to acquire medicine or the raw materials with which we produce medicine. The effort the country is doing to manufacture medicine, it is incredible. We would need about $1.5 and $1.9 billion to buy medicine. And do you know how we achieved that? We achieved that with an investment of 300 million because we are capable of producing most of the medicine, of the basic medicines. So with 300 million, we do practically the same of what we should have done if we used the $1.9 billion dollars, and we have allocated some of those incomes to face the pandemic and to develop the vaccines. And I see how in the world, how the countries that have developed vaccines, they talk about billions and billions allocated to the program vaccines. I say to our scientists, I will not even ask how much you have used, because there's data that is not recorded, which is the will that those scientists have, and with that they have produced vaccines. But also to produce vaccines we need more supplies, and we lack certain components that we are seeking to have in the last possible time. The production and all the doses we have for our population, and also to give to the world. And we have the problem of the hard currency shops, and we have explained why we have used that measure. If we do not have money, not even to supply the national currency shops, so we have to take part of the hard currency in the country, and also to have more offers and more supply in the shops for the population. And we have actually used that, but as part of the restrictive measures, and as we were included in the list of countries that support terrorism, then we have not exported the hard currency we have collected, and that has caught the financial flux. So everything we do to work for the population, to improve the population, is what they have. I mean, they have targeted those efforts.
So Cuba serving the people, investing in medicine, food, healthcare, doing all these things despite sanctions, despite the blockade, and of course it's going to be challenging. But there you go, President Miguel Diaz-Canel talking about the impact of sanctions. Comrade Oni, both of you have been to Cuba, but Comrade Oni, why don't you tell us a little bit about your experience in Cuba and how the blockade has impacted everyday life there?
Sure, yeah, we were both on the 50th anniversary delegation of the Vencenamas Brigade, which was like 2 years ago now, 2 years ago. And that was the first time I had ever gone to Cuba. I was there for 2 weeks, traveled all over the island with the brigade, talking to Cuban people, talking to Cuban organizations, and learning the truth about Cuba. And I realized I knew very little about Cuba before I went there. Mm-hmm. But one thing we definitely noticed, I remember the director of the camp where we stayed talking about how they were rolling blackouts in her neighborhood. And the reason why that was happening is because the U.S., like Venezuela and Cuba, had a deal where Venezuela would provide Cuba with oil, and the U.S. had intercepted a Venezuelan oil ship. Just the oil was like already said, like Venezuela was like, this is Cuba's, like this is yours, we're delivering it to you. The U.S. was like, yoink, took it, confiscated the ship. Cuba could not get any oil. Cuba could not keep its lights on. So like things like that. And then also there were like long lines for gas so people could fill their cars because there were shortages. So that was just like a very small example of the kind of like day-to-day deprivation that the blockade creates in Cuba. It's very arbitrary. The U.S. like flexed its muscle. It throws its weight around to like intercept orders that are already paid for, to deprive them of basic necessities. And then it turns around and on the media in the United States, it's like, oh, they're waiting in line for bread. Look at these gas lines all around the corner, all these shortages of medications and things. And they leave out the fact that it's the U.S. causing the problem. It's actually pathological. The other thing that was that I learned that was incorrect, that I've always heard about Cuba, was that there was no internet and the access to it was tightly controlled. Turns out like it's actually very easy to get onto the internet. You have to pay. It's incredibly slow. And the reason why it's incredibly slow is because they have to depend on satellites. They have like high-speed internet fiber optic cables running like next to the island under the water that they cannot tap into. Again, because of the U.S. blockade. The U.S. threatens companies into not doing business with Cuba, and so Cuba cannot access high-speed internet despite the infrastructure for it existing. So things like that, they leave out a major part of the story. They deliberately inflict suffering on the Cuban people, not the government, the Cuban people, and then they turn around and say, "Look what the government's doing," and it's very infuriating.
Yeah, it's gaslighting. I think we were talking about this before, right? It's like gaslighting. It's like you're accusing your enemy of everything that you're doing. You're saying that they're doing it, and you're flipping it, reversing it. You're saying that you're the victim, they're the perpetrator, they're the bad guy, and it's psychological maneuver. That's why the media component is so important in and having this conversation, because 95% of the conversations out there just come from this pro-imperialist position that the Cuban government is responsible for everything. No connection to the blockade, no connection to sanctions. But Comrade Yhamir, your experience in Cuba, what was it like seeing the impact of sanctions in Cuba when you were there?
Trying to really think. I feel like going to Cuba, it's like it's such a different vibe, because when you go to Cuba, it's like you don't see no U.S. corporations there. You don't see no McDonald's, no Burger King, no Taco Bell, like in other Latin American countries. And it feels so like natural, so preserved. And just like when you go all over Cuba, it's like a big time homage to the revolution. You see like murals of Che, you see murals of Camilo, you see statues of Martí, you see also statues of Antonio Maceo, who was an Afro-Cuban general during the Independence War, who fought alongside Martí. And yeah, I mean, seeing the impacts, I felt like as far as like Cuba's development, like infrastructure, yeah, you can see the impacts right there of sanctions. The fact that like Cuba, they're still driving cars from the 1950s, but yet them cars are still working very well. They're still working. But I felt like I don't know, I remember when I was when I was with an artist like in Santiago, I got to learn a little bit more of like why people want to leave Cuba, because the fact that like certain projects that they have, like certain like I guess individual projects, whether it's being an artist or other type of stuff that is outside of being like a doctor or a teacher, they're unable to get they can't get far in Cuba because of the blockade. There was actually this interesting documentary called War on Cuba, and there was a part in the first episode where you had like this woman. She was like an entrepreneur. She wanted to sell clothing and all this other stuff. And when Obama like kind of levied a little bit the blockade, she thought she was gonna have a future in Cuba, like selling her line, her clothing. But then that all came to an end when he re-intensified the blockade. So yeah, that was like my experience, traveling through Cuba and seeing the effects. But like I also like it's kind of hard to like see the effects when you also see a people that are very resilient, that are very like what we say in Spanish, muy echado pa'lante, very like forward with basically defending the revolution, taking pride in the revolution, continuing with the projects, growing their own food, and just moving forward regardless of the blockade. I mean, Cuba is the only country in Latin America that has been able to produce, I think it's two types of vaccines for COVID-19 in all Latin America, and that's due to a blockade, under a blockade.
Yeah, no, it's crazy. That's exactly right. And I mean, the Cuban medical system is amazing, sending doctors all over the world to help cure people, to help treat them as they're undergoing this pandemic. And like Anthony says in the chat, Anthony Penza, Cuba's proof that simply building things to last makes capitalism irrelevant. And in Cuba, that's really what it's about. It's about going back to like that concept of Marxism, of use value, even though they don't have things that have a lot of exchange value, that are wealthy, that we would consider as valuable in capitalist society. Because I think that's one of the I've personally never been to Cuba, but one thing that I've noticed from people who go to Cuba that aren't political or aren't really socialists is that they have a Western understanding of how they understand value. They're like, oh, these buildings are older, or this is older. And it's like they don't place value. For me, I see hospitals and schools as valuable, not like movie theaters, and whether you have shopping malls and all these false commodities that have fake value. And so I think it's like really about realigning our values, how we understand value. And I think Cuba really understands that in such a good way. And it's cool that both of you guys have actually been to Cuba and have seen that, and have seen the impact of the blockade, because that's something that we have to really keep in mind. Is the blockade is so important. Talking a little bit about the actual like media propaganda, one thing that I've noticed is that a lot of the right wingers will say, oh, stop blaming your problems on the US. This is like, if in any way, if you say that, points out that the US has been trying to destabilize Cuba since 1960, since the revolution, you're a conspiracy theorist, you're crazy, the US would never do that. This is all Cuba's fault. But I started doing some research on something called Operation Northwoods, which was a false flag attack that was planned by the U.S. government against Cuba to try to overthrow Fidel. There's an interesting clip I want to share with y'all about Operation Northwoods, this false flag attack that was attempted on Cuba early on in the revolution, just as to show you that like the U.S. has been fucking around with Cuba for decades. This is not some conspiracy theories. This is something that they've been planning. There are declassified documents showing all this. So I'm going to play this clip, and then we can talk a little bit about U.S. destabilization attempts and how media plays a role.
Operation Northwoods was proposed after many failures to try and cause the Cuban government to be overthrown from the inside. The entire memorandum is only 15 pages long, so if you want to look it up and read it, it won't take very long. In this document, there were 9 different plans to justify a war with Cuba. Number 1. Carry out U.S. military provocations near Cuba under the guise that they are just military training. Ideally for the U.S., this would cause Cuba to respond aggressively, to which the U.S. could say that the Cubans attacked an otherwise non-hostile training mission and justify a war with that. Number 2. Staging Cuban defectors working with the U.S. outside of Guantanamo Bay and having them attack Guantanamo Bay. After the fake assailants were captured, more Cuban defectors would start riots outside the base, eventually leading to another fake attack on the base, mortars being fired into the base, fires being started, and even included a plan for fake funerals and fake victims of the fake attack. Number 3. Basically, remember the main part 2. The document even puts the idea forward like that. The US would essentially just have a ship somewhere around Cuba, have it blow up, and blame Cuba. Number 4. Cause terror campaigns in the Miami or Washington area. Foster fake attempts at the lives of Cuban refugees, set off carefully placed bombs, and even, and this is the most disturbing part to me, sink real or simulated ships of Cuban refugees fleeing Cuba. Number 5. Have Cuban planes that aren't actually Cuban planes attack neighboring Caribbean countries. 6. Harass US shipping and destroy US drones with US planes made to look like Cuban MiG fighter jets. Number 7. Attempt hijacks under the guise that they are by Cuban government supporters and being directly pushed by the Cuban government. Number 8. A very detailed plan that involved taking 2 civilian aircraft and making them look exactly the same, except one would be piloted remotely with no one in it, and the other would be filled with real people. The plane with the real people would take off from the normal airport, supposedly heading to somewhere like Panama or Jamaica, but would eventually go and land at an auxiliary US airbase. And the drone-piloted plane would fly the rest of the way over Cuba. Then, while over Cuba, it would play an automated message saying something to the extent of, "Mayday, we are under attack by what appears to be a Cuban MiG aircraft. I repeat, that's a Cuban aircraft, as in from Cuba, the Cuban military. The Cuban military is definitely attacking us." And then be blown up remotely to make it seem like it had been shot down. Number 9, make it seem like Cuban MiGs destroyed a US military aircraft in an unprovoked attack.
So this is all stuff that is declassified, by the way. Go look it up. Operation Northwoods, publicly available information, not anything that's fake. This is all available online. This is what the US government was planning to do decades ago in the 60s. Imagine what they're still trying to do today at the level of technicality with media, with AI, with bots. So Comrade Only, maybe you can comment on your thoughts on the new tactics of US imperialism in subverting Cuba, maybe talking about Twitter or social media and how they're trying to manipulate the masses into supporting regime change.
It's definitely a regular warfare. That's what the president of Cuba called it in his speech. A regular warfare attempting to manufacture color revolutions. Color revolutions are, of course, uprisings that appear to be grassroots but are actually directed by an outside force, usually by imperialist power. So that's clearly a strategy that they're using against Cuba now. They use it against Venezuela as well. They use it against Libya. So it's like kind of the standard set of strategies right now alongside sanctions. So right now, there is like an army of bots on Twitter, just like assaulting Cuban people in their mentions. A Cuban person says something in favor of the revolution, in favor or against U.S. intervention, and all of a sudden they're just like diluted with like dozens of mentions of people being hostile as hell, talking about we need U.S. intervention in Cuba, like down with communism. Like it's unfolding. You can watch it happen in real time. Dozens of replies to these poor Cuban people defending the revolution, or to really anyone who is defending the Cuban revolution. These are not real people. These are bots that have been deployed for this specific purpose. And it makes you ask, who is doing that? And again, we saw that happened in Venezuela. We saw that it happened in Libya. It's actually happening right now with Eritrea and Ethiopia. So it is part of the strategy. And they pair this, the sanctions that Cuba is suffering under were heightened during the pandemic. So the Trump administration took a strategy of saying, we are going to cause maximum suffering at this time to apply as much pressure as possible on Cuba. And then Biden came in and carried that forward. And then all of a sudden we see this attempted color revolution rising up in Cuba. It's not out of nowhere. This is clearly an orchestrated campaign.
Yeah, most definitely. And it falls in line with that new strategy. Something that we've been talking about as well on previous streams is the Congress for Cultural Freedom 1947 CIA plan to support quote unquote pro-democracy protesters. That's where a lot of the color revolution style tactics came from. They were first used against the Soviet Union and Hungary and Czechoslovakia and Bulgaria and some of the countries that were on the Soviet bloc to try to attack the left from the left, make it seem like people are demanding freedom and liberty and taking advantage, creating divisions where there are, and expanding them and taking advantage, capitalizing on that. And it's something that's insane. But Comrade Yhamir, what have you been seeing on social media in terms of like the media war against Cuba, and any other thoughts about U.S. destabilization attempts against Cuba?
Yeah, so I think the hashtag SOS Cuba makes me laugh a lot, because I feel like they're trying to make a false equivalency with what's going on like in my motherland of Colombia with the SOS Colombia, and trying to make people like try to take the rhetoric of like the uprisings going on in countries in Latin America, whether it's Colombia or Haiti, that or Brazil, that are protesting against capitalism, against neoliberalism that is intertwined with imperialism. So in Cuba right now, the people are uprising because of the lack of need, the lack of food and medicine, which is connected with the blockade, and which the blockade is imposed for those means to create discomfort amongst the population and to create dissent. So they blame their government and want to overthrow their government. But I feel like it's just I don't know. It's crazy when I see like people on social media, especially like leftists. Like my man from Rebel Diaz, Rodstar, said it the best. It's crazy how y'all were like quoting Asada, and now they're hashtag SOS Cuba. Like I'm gonna go off. Like it's crazy when you want to say Black Lives Matter, but now you're hashtagging SOS Cuba, and without lacking like any knowledge of what Cuba is, the Cuban Revolution, of how they have Asada Shakur, the godmother and aunt of Tupac Shakur, ex-revolutionary Black Panther, has political asylum in Cuba, and how the United States has been wanting to get her back, and the fact how Cuba has shown international solidarity with the African diaspora, whether it's in Africa, Angola, South Africa, Namibia, or people in the States, or Afro-Latinos in Latin America. So to me, it's just I've been going back and forth on social media with these like so-called I don't know what you call them, like the social justice warriors,
SJWs, yeah,
lack like this anti-imperialist consciousness.
Indeed, well said. And I'm glad. Oh, my fault. I'm glad you pointed out the whole thing about people praising Asada and saying Black Lives Matter, but then bashing Cuba. Comrade Only, your reaction to people like that? Have you seen that on social media? People who were once, quoting Asada and saying Black Lives Matter and are now talking shit about Cuba, and your reaction to that?
I mean, they're just being led around by the nose, right? Because like I just said, at the height of the COVID-19 pandemic, the US government tightened the blockade on Cuba, made it worse, made it cause more suffering. Cuba's population is majority African and has been so since the 1700s, y'all. So when the blockade was tightened, when there were more restrictions, when there were more shortages, like guess who was impacted? African people. And y'all had not a word to say, like not a peep, not a peep. And then all of a sudden the New York Times is like, look at all these white people protesting in Cuba against the regime. And you're like, oh, we got to show up for Cuba. Meanwhile, if you look at the pro-revolution protests in Havana and throughout Cuba, they are filled with African people, dark-skinned brown people, y'all. It is very clear where African people stand when it comes to the question of the Cuban Revolution. Because the Cuban Revolution, first of all, we fought in it. Second of all, it made our lives better. It made our lives better. So you cannot say Black Lives Matter. You cannot say you're showing up for African people in Cuba if you are standing against the Cuban Revolution, if you're standing with imperialism when it's attacking it.
Yeah, and it's the same similar situation in all the anti-imperialist countries that have liberated themselves from the yoke of Washington and Wall Street. And Venezuela, the Escualidos who support the opposition, they look like they just got off the conquistador boat and just set up a colony, and they're just racist as fuck. Like the right-wing Venezuelans in Miami or anywhere, extremely racist. Right-wing Cubans in Miami, don't even get me started on that. Right-wing Nicaraguans who oppose the Sandinista revolution, same thing, very racist, very backward, reactionary. And it just tells you, just looking at this is why it's so important for the left and communists to understand the national question, that you can't have socialism without national liberation, without the liberation of African and indigenous peoples, because through the liberation of African and indigenous peoples, retaking control of the means of production, of the wealth of the country, building socialism and getting rid of the settler population that has historically sided with imperialism, that is what true liberation looks like for our countries in the global south. And I think that understanding that, seeing it's so clear, you look at the pro-government revolution protesters in Cuba, black and brown, you look at a lot of the opposition, and mostly white, some black and brown people in there. But again, I think Comrade Yhamir made a good point in the beginning as well, that not everybody's necessarily right-wing, and there are people that have legitimate grievances, but unfortunately, because of the social media campaign, because of media manipulation, they've been diverted into this nonsense. And adding to that, I want to play this clip from RT. Comrade Erica mentioned it in the chat, actually. Shout out to her. This is a report from 2014 about U.S. fueling dissent in Cuba with fake Twitter.
Well, we're just learning more about a U.S. government program that's been operating as a clandestine tech startup fueling dissent within Cuba. An investigation by the Associated Press finds that in 2009, the U.S. Agency for International Development launched a simple Twitter-like social networking site in Cuba with the intent of stirring up political unrest in the country. The social networking platform, called Zunzuneo, allowed users to avoid internet censors and communicate through cell phone text messages. But it also allowed U.S. officials to target users with messages from abroad. The idea was that if they drew users in with non-controversial topics like soccer and music, the program could ultimately help activists organize mass gatherings like political demonstrations at a moment's notice. At its peak, the social networking site had 40,000 subscribers. But of course, the users were provided no information that the network was financed and operated by the U.S. government. To do this, USAID used a network of shell companies under a Cayman Island bank account to keep the government's ties under wraps. The AP also reports that Zunzuneo's computers were tracking the messages and demographic information on the users to help USAID target its other Cuba programs. Earlier today, White House Press Secretary Jay Carney disputed claims that the program was covert.
It was not a covert program. It was debated in Congress. It was reviewed by the GAO. Those kinds of things don't happen to covert programs. It was a development assistance program about, increasing the level of information that the Cuban people have and were able to discuss among themselves.
While Carney says the efforts were meant to increase the free flow of information, we have yet to hear Cuba's thoughts on the program. The social media program ended abruptly in September of 2012 when a government grant ended.
That's the next level generation of warfare in imperialism today. Social media, information, and that's why it's important we're having these conversations, because that's how they're winning the hearts and minds of good intentioned people. Not everybody is bad, but there are people who have legitimate grievances, but they're being won over by this imperialist propaganda. So sinister, so horrible how the US imperialist media is doing this. We saw the same happen in Nicaragua as well. Actually, me and Yhamir, when we were in Nicaragua, we heard a presentation about the role of these social media accounts that they would create, and they were like sleeper cells for over several years. They would post content that was apolitical, that didn't talk about anything. And then boom, overnight, it was like SOS Nicaragua, SOS, now SOS Cuba. And so it's crazy because we're seeing that same tactic and strategy being used over and over. So Comrade Oni, what are your thoughts on how people can combat the social media misinformation against Cuba?
I think that we got to tell the truth. Those of us have been there, those of us have studied it and read about it, like, have to tell the truth and have to be unapologetic about it. I feel like whenever the imperialism, Western imperialism, US imperialism attacks a country, all of a sudden people want to be nuanced about the country. All of a sudden people want to get their licks in, get their critiques in, but that's not the time. It's not the time. We have to be clear and uncompromising. If you want to help the Cuban people, then end the blockade. If you want to help the Cuban people, then stop trying to overthrow their government. It doesn't matter if we have criticisms of that government from the belly of the beast. It's not relevant. We do not have the right to sit back and watch as our government tries to destroy a free country. It's not right. So I think that we have to be uncompromising and clear. I saw a comrade, Max Aji with Monthly Review, talking about how when it comes to the Palestinian solidarity movement, when it comes to the solidarity with the struggle against Zionism, people are not like, oh, well, these are the contradictions of the Palestinian state, so how can we really support them? No, they're like completely focused on, no, Israel's an apartheid state, Zionism is white supremacist, these people have a right to exist, we're going to resist that by any means necessary, and they're clear on their points. This is the level we have to get to with the Cuba Solidarity movement. This is the level we have to get to with every single anti-imperialist movement. It's not about the internal contradictions of these countries. It's about the United States attempting to destroy them, period.
Yeah, no, it's crazy. I mean, it's so disgusting seeing people, especially a lot of white leftists in the first world in the US, who are like, oh, well, they're not real socialists, they're not real revolutionaries. And even within the quote unquote left, some ultra left, some so-called Maoists who will say that Cuba was a Soviet sugar colony, that it's state capitalism, that it used to be revolutionary, but it's no longer, just because they have a small market sector or because they traded with China. And just like you said, Comrade Oni, now is not the time to be divisive and looking at, oh, well, I like this and that, even though our sisters and brothers are being attacked by US imperialism. And it's just so disgusting to see that. It's cowardly, it's disgusting. And it's another reason why, as anti-imperialists, as principled revolutionaries, we have to understand that we have to put those things aside and defend Cuba against attacks. I say the same thing as well about like Syria and other countries that are not trendy to defend, but we have to defend and be in solidarity with them. But Comrade Yhamir, your thoughts and reaction to like the Twitter mobs, the Twitter people, the bots, and also your reaction to people who claim that Cuba isn't revolutionary enough to defend.
Yeah, the social media activists out there.
Right. Yep.
Twitter gangsters.
Twitter gangsters. Yeah.
Twitter, yeah. I mean, my response to that, I mean, it's kind of hard following up Comrade Oni. That was fire right there, and like that was on point. Yeah, I mean, like what Comrade Oni said, be unapologetic, stand for Cuba. Talk about the history of the revolution, let people, I guess, know how all of this is like propaganda. What else? Yeah, and like, we defend Cuba because we're revolutionaries, we're internationalists, we're anti-imperialists. So we show up for Cuba. Like when Diaz-Canel was telling the Cuban people, all the revolutionaries out to the streets, I felt like he was telling that to like me, to everybody, that are revolutionaries and appreciate the Cuban Revolution and what it's done for the world. Just like the way we also show up for Haiti, because of the Haitian Revolution of 1804, where you had a successful slave revolution where the slaves abolished slavery and they took state power. It's the same thing with the Cuban Revolution, where you had an island that was basically a casino for the U.S. mafia class that had a revolution and created one of the first socialist states within the Americas, not just Latin America and the Caribbean, but within the Americas. So this is why, regardless of Cuba's contradiction or whether people think Cuba's not revolutionary enough, just to answer your other question, like it's about defending the self-determination of the people and not wanting the United States and these gusanos from Miami to recolonize the island of Cuba. Like, if you want to help the Cuban people lift the blockade, see how the blockade is now a real thing. It's not just an excuse that the Cuban government wants to just throw out there. It's a reality. People have shortages of food. People have shortages of medicine. And also, like, I've also read reports too, due to the crisis of COVID-19, there's been a lack of tourism. So if the island doesn't have tourism, the island doesn't have money. And if the island doesn't have money, then they cannot buy the products that they need. And also, like, something I didn't mention before and something that I learned in Cuba is the fact that, like, Cuba would love to do trading with its neighboring Latin American countries, but it can, unfortunately, if those companies that they want to trade with have 1% U.S. ownership, just like they wish they could trade rice with Mexico. But because of NAFTA in the early in the 90s, I think 90s or 200s, you could correct me, but most of the companies in Mexico are U.S. owned or have a percentage of U.S. ownership, and Cuba cannot trade with them because of the blockade. That's why they have to get their rice imported from all the way from China, which takes, like, I don't know how long on a boat. Like, it probably takes a week to get to Cuba. But I mean, those are the effects of the blockade, and that's why we have to see why it's important for us to really acknowledge and understand the complexities and the kind of forgetting my words right now, but
so good.
yeah, and even the sense of the blockade. I mean, I feel like I'll try not to use the word sanctions, because that's a term used in the UN to punish another countries. These are illegal, unilateral, coercive measures. Like, they're illegal because these sanctions, when a country gets sanctioned on, it's supposed to take a vote in the UN, and this has never been voted on. The United States has imposed this with their own will just because they don't forgive Cuba for their revolution. And on top of that too, they had a vote like two weeks ago, and most of the nation states, I think over 187, voted against the blockade, for the lifting of the blockade. And you had like 2 countries, which is the United States and Israel, that voted against. So we have to see how these like the concept of a sanction is illegal.
Yeah, most definitely. It's illegal, and it's a way of completely sabotaging and destabilizing a country and making it seem like it's the fault of socialism, because that's what a lot of imperialist propaganda do. Like, they'll impose these people who are evangelists for capitalism. They're like, the free market, no state intervention. But they sure as hell love state intervention when it comes to intervening in the affairs of other countries, destabilizing their economies, imposing sanctions, imposing unilateral coercive measures, as compañero Yhamir was saying, and blaming the failures of the economy on socialism, on revolutionary anti-imperialism. And it's just a crazy, sick mind game that they keep playing. But I'm glad you mentioned Haiti, because I have been to Haiti twice. Beautiful resistance by the people. Haiti is a beautiful nation that's rich, but has been plundered and pillaged by the imperialists, by the core nations that they call France, US, Canada, and the UK, that have plundered the nation. And there's so much resistance in Haiti. And one of the coolest things that I found in Haiti, not only do the Haitian people love the Cuban Revolution, I went to this neighborhood named La Saline, which is the poorest neighborhood in the Western Hemisphere, not even just Haiti, but the poorest neighborhood in the Western Hemisphere, what they would call a slum. And all over the neighborhood, when I was walking around, I saw portraits of Che Guevara, Fidel Castro, the Cuban Revolution. People love the Cuban Revolution in Haiti, and in a lot of the protests will wave Cuban flags in support because the people want a socialist. Haiti is a free market, neoliberal, imposed disaster because of imperialism. That system has been imposed on the Haitian people. And a lot of Cuban doctors have gone to Haiti to volunteer, to train. I also got a chance to visit the University of the Aristide Foundation, where Cuban doctors will help train impoverished Haitian medical students and eventually go to Cuba and learn and go around the world. So there's a lot of reverence and respect for the Cuban people. Comrade Oni, I wanted to ask you, for people who are unfamiliar with Cuba's global solidarity with African people, not only in Haiti and in Cuba and in the Caribbean, but on the African continent as well, why don't you give us an overview of some of that? Because I think a lot of people really aren't familiar with just how much Cuba has done for the African diaspora globally.
Yeah, I mean, Cuba helped stop the spread of apartheid in Southern Africa by assisting the national liberation struggles in Angola and Mozambique and Namibia. Cuba assisted anti-colonial struggles all over the African continent. And when I say assisted, I mean they sent hundreds of thousands of doctors, of soldiers, of teachers. A lot of times we're making a one-way trip because those Cubans would give their lives for the anti-colonial struggles in Africa. They sent guns, they sent money, they sent resources all over to anti-colonial struggles throughout the African continent. They did that throughout the Caribbean as well. They did it in Central and South America. In the modern day, they helped eradicate malaria in multiple African nations. They sent doctors on solidarity missions constantly. When Ebola broke out and the Obama administration was trying to figure out how to capitalize on it to spread its military footprint in Africa, Cuba was sending doctors to the hot zones to assist people, to treat people medically. So Cuba is very often the only medical infrastructure that exists. Cuban doctors are the only medical infrastructure that exists for a lot of places, including in Africa. So Cuba has showed up for African revolutionary struggles all over the world. Comrade Yhamir mentioned Assata Shakur found safe haven in Cuba after being persecuted by the U.S. government for trying to liberate her people. She is far from the only Black Panther that found refuge in Cuba. It happened dozens of times that we don't know about, and Cuba took those people in. So Cuba has always showed up for the African liberation struggle because Cuba, as I already said, is an African nation, has a majority African population. When they are showing up for our struggles, they're showing up for themselves. They understand that quite clearly. Cuban culture has proud African roots that you see very clearly when you go to the island. So Cuba and African culture and African struggles for liberation are deeply connected, and they always have been. And this is why, as an African revolutionary, I will always go hard for Cuba, because Cuba has gone hard for us.
And even in our native Honduras along the coast where the Garifuna communities exist, there are Cuban doctors. When I was in Honduras in 2019, there were Cuban doctors helping to treat Garifuna patients all over the coast. And actually, very recently, the right-wing government of Juan Orlando Hernandez banned Cuban doctors from operating on the coast of Honduras, which is predominantly Afro-Indigenous. So you have a right-wing U.S.-installed puppet government banning Cuban doctors who are just helping the people, bringing medicine, especially during COVID-19, saying that they were spreading communism, saying all this horrible stuff. And Cuba has so much solidarity around the world in places we don't even know about. And they do so many great things for not only just African and indigenous people, but all people. They sent a huge brigade to Italy as well during the COVID-19 pandemic, one of the hardest hit countries. And the role of Cuba internationally in terms of supporting revolutions, especially during the 70s and 80s, a lot of the Civil War, the liberation movements in Latin America and the Caribbean, in Guatemala, in El Salvador, and Nicaragua. In the 70s, the Cuban government helped support the guerrilla movements there, as well as in Colombia as well, the guerrilla movements that were fighting against the repressive right-wing government, and Palestinian solidarity, DPRK. I mean, in my opinion, I think Cuba has been one of the most international socialist countries in the last half century, if not in a long time. And so it's just important to say that, right? Because I think now is the time for the international community, the real international community, the working class of the world, to show solidarity with Cuba at a time that it needs that support. But I wanted to also turn it back to Comrade Yhamir to talk a little bit about something we were talking about on the last stream, which is hip hop and music, and how the right wing has been able to capitalize on using that. And what is your analysis of the role? Because we were talking last time about the San Isidro movement and how they have been funding like hip hop artists to speak out against the government. What connection do you see there with what's going on?
Well, it's a good time you asked me that question. I switched my background. I have Tupac right here.
Oh, that's what's up.
I had to charge my laptop. Yeah, to answer your question, it's very interesting how now they're utilizing this music genre that comes all the way in New York City, in the slums, in the South Bronx of Black and brown people, Black and Latino people, and trying to weaponize it against the revolutionary Cuban government, and utilizing these Cuban rappers like this group San Isidro or this other group called Los Aldeanos that basically try to create a narrative by wearing like this like revolutionary aesthetic, and it's like connected with this color revolution that we talk about like just being rebellious just for the fuck of it. It's like there's no like context to it. There's no like analysis. There's no like anti-imperialism. This is this whole rhetoric of that we're the rebels, we're the youth, and we're trying to rebel against this so-called authoritarian government. But yet people don't know that they get funding from these NGOs like USAID or the National Endowment for Democracy, and basically get paid by the United States government to make these hip hop songs as a tactic to create dissent amongst the youth in Cuba to win them over and be like, oh, that we're really oppressed. Just like that song, like, oh man, you just made me think right now. Like you saw in those rallies too, like, I mean, the ones who are counter-revolution, how they're wearing the Patria y Vida, because that song with Gente de Zona,
right.
That it's a horrible song anyways, but like it's crazy how now they're using like that. They try to flip slogans like Patria y Muerte, homeland and death, trying to say Patria, homeland and life. I mean, people in Cuba appreciate life, and they put that slogan homeland and death because they're willing to die for their homeland, because they love their homeland so much. They love their history. They love all aspects of the Cuban society, that they're willing to die for it, to preserve it for future generations. And it's funny how they use these tactics. But yeah, I mean, it's important for us to promote revolutionary culture amongst the youth too, because like we said in the last stream too, there's a critique in the Cuban government of not like kind of like relating with the youth, and you kind of get lost after a while, because it's over 60 years of the revolution. Like all these like young revolutionaries that were rebellious in the 60s are now like 70, 80 years old. So there's always like a disconnect, but it's important for at least the youth right now in Cuba. Like if there's any reawakening of the Cuban history, Cuban revolution amongst the youth, now is the time. Now is the time for them to see the importance of them defending their homeland, of them defending their revolution, that their inheritance of their ancestors, of the comandantes that fought for the Cuba for them.
Yeah, most definitely. That's part of the continuing work, is making it relevant, bringing the youth, updating the Cuban Revolution to the 21st century, including new conditions. That's what Marxism is all about. And the Cuban Communist Party is guided by Marxism, Leninism, adapting to the new situation, using new tactics to build socialism. And that's the endless goal that even we as revolutionaries continue to try to focus on and build, is how do we reach the people, the next generation, the Zoomers, who are just learning about this stuff and maybe are dissuaded by some of the imperialist propaganda that's out there, bringing them back to our camp. And that's something that's ongoing. But just to kind of wrap up here, it's been really dope talking to you, comrades. Comrade Oni, any actions coming up on your end, or anything that people should look out for in relation to Cuba?
So the July 25th, last Sunday in July, is the monthly Cuba Solidarity car caravans all over the world. They started in Havana, they spread to the United States, now they're happening in Canada, they're happening in Europe, they're happening in Central and South America. So it's truly a global movement in solidarity with Cuba, calling for the end of the U.S. blockade on Cuba. And this coming July 25th, they should be massive, y'all. Like, that would be big as hell. We got to let these people know that we see what they're doing. We're not cool with it. We need the blockade to end. We need to do a stop attacking the Cuban Revolution. So definitely see if there's a Cuba car caravan in your city on Sunday, July 25th. And if there isn't, consider organizing one. It's not that hard. It's not that hard at all. You just need a starting location and a way to decorate your car and a route, and you can show people that we need to unite with Cuba. So please show up for those on July 25th. And then also, as we've discussed at length on the stream, Cuba is facing a lot of shortages of necessary medical supplies because of the US blockade on Cuba. For example, Cuba has 5 separate vaccines to fight COVID-19. Cuba does not have syringes to distribute its vaccine to its population. They do not have enough. And so there's a Syringes for Cuba campaign being organized, put together by organizations like Code Pink, that is raising money to give to Cuba so they have cash to buy syringes to distribute this vaccine to their population and to third world countries around the world. So Code Pink has a Syringes for Cuba website that I'll put in the comments on YouTube. And the Ben Stems Brigade is also raising money for that campaign as well.
Thank you so much, Comrade Oni. And again, if you haven't, please subscribe to her channel, AAPRP New Mexico. They have some really great videos, content, streams every Thursday, Pan-African Weekly News. Really great stuff. And Comrade Yhamir, just wrapping up with you, any final thoughts on stuff going on in Cuba? Anything that on the horizon that you want to let people know about?
Well, just really quickly, Comrade Oni, you mentioned about the July 25th car caravan, about how there's going to be like there's a call also for people to come to DC because you have like you have a brother, I think his name is Carlos Lanzo, that he's a Cuban American school teacher that is doing like the pilgrimage to DC and inviting people to come as far as like the support of his campaign, like the Cuban Americans that have been doing the caravan nationwide against the blockade. You mentioned that, right?
Yeah.
Okay, good. I'm just making sure. So there's that. And then this coming Thursday in New York City, there's going to be a rally, a solidarity rally for Cuba in defense of the revolution by the young, I think they're called the New York Young Communist League in connection with the Cuba Sí, Bloqueo No coalition. Union Square is going to take place at 5 p.m. in the afternoon. So, it's time also for the revolutionaries, just like President Miguel Díaz-Canel said, to come out in solidarity for Cuba, the internationalists. Why? Because Cuba has been there, like Oni said, has been there for all of us, whether it's African people, whether it's people from Asia, the Middle East, Latin America, the working class worldwide. And it's time for us to come out and defend Cuba against U.S. imperialism.
Well, Steph, Comrade Yhamir, well said. And please subscribe to his channel, The Bolivarian Flame. The link is in the description. He's has some great content coming your way. And it's been really dope talking to both of you, comrades. I hope you both have a great day. We're going to end the stream by going off with a beautiful song from the Cuban people, Con Cuba No Te Metas, an anti-imperialist song produced a few months ago before all of this nonsense was coming out, but still relevant. Peace, and thank you so much, comrades. Have a great day. Take care.
Bye.
Peace.
Bye.
Que viva Cuba.
Preocupado el presidente anaranjado, viendo que las elecciones las perdió.
Solicita a los que le hacen los mandados que se apuren pues la fiesta terminó.
Y mirando que se va a acabar el varo,
han formado un titingo. Se han negado a abandonar la Casa Blanca, a la silla del despacho se amarró. Los pelitos que le quedan los arranca, pataleando por la rabia que le dio. Y mirando a Cuba con sus batas blancas, de cabeza se tiró.
El que tenga confusión que se confunda, el que quiera claridad que venga a ver.
La jugada no es compleja ni profunda, está claro cómo quieren proceder.
Solo falta que nosotros los dejemos,
y eso no va a suceder.
Con la conga de los hoyos no te metas,
no te metas, no te metas. patria, mi bandera se respeta. De La Habana para Santiago, defiende lo tuyo, cubano.
Que no te metas con mi tierra, que mi Cuba se respeta.
Soy el mambí que aún vive con el machete en la mano. No, 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 no. ¿Qué me importa si comentas?
De donde vengo yo, estamos listos para la contienda. Aguanta y pero dime tú, ¿pa' qué tú inventas? Con mi pueblo guarachando, yo vine aquí para cantar. Toda Cuba está esperando que yo la ponga a gozar.
Aquí nadie tiene miedo, tú conmigo no te metas. Oye, soquetón, mi alegría te molesta.